The evening mist clung to the trees as I parked my car at the entrance. Hollow Pines Sanctuary stood imposing against the darkening sky, its weathered brick facade a stark contrast to the vibrant autumn forest surrounding it. I hadn't expected such grandeur. The building's curved windows and sharp roof lines created an almost Gothic silhouette against the fading light. Adjusting my messenger bag, I took a steadying breath. My first day was about to begin. The gravel path crunched beneath my boots as I approached the entrance. The glass doors slid open with a soft whisper, welcoming me into a rush of artificially warm air. Inside, the stark contrast was immediate. Polished marble floors reflected the soft amber glow of wall sconces, making the space feel both elegant and eerily quiet. The reception area was deserted except for an antique brass bell and a leather-bound visitor log. I hesitated, scanning the empty foyer before the echo of approaching footsteps caught my attention. "Dr. Mercer, I presume?" The voice was deep and measured, carrying a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. I turned to find Dr. Ellis approaching, his tall frame graceful despite his age, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. He extended his hand, his grip surprisingly warm and firm. "Yes, that's me," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Excellent. Timeliness speaks volumes about character." He nodded approvingly. "Follow me." Without waiting for acknowledgement, he turned and began walking briskly down a corridor. I hurried to match his pace, my footsteps echoing against the marble. "Hollow Pines," Dr. Ellis began, his cadence measured and deliberate, "is the most prestigious institution of its kind in the Northeast. The work we do here requires absolute precision and discretion. I expect nothing less from you." His words weren't a request but a statement of fact. I nodded, though his back was turned to me. His stride was purposeful as he guided me through the labyrinthine hallways, pointing out various chambers and their functions with clinical efficiency. The preservation room carried the subtle scent of cedar and chemicals. The visitation chambers, though designed with comfort in mind with their plush seating and soft lighting, somehow felt hollow, spaces where grief was contained rather than expressed. Each room we passed seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Dr. Ellis spoke of procedures and protocols, of honor and respect. But beneath his words ran an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that seemed to pulse within the very walls of the building. We came to a stop before a heavy oak door marked simply Section 13. The air here felt different, heavier, as though time itself moved more slowly. The soft humming of what I assumed were ventilation systems seemed louder, more insistent. Dr. Ellis turned to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "This," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "is Section 13. You will ensure it remains sealed at all times. 7 rotations without exception." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. 7 rotations? "Yes," he replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Always 7. Never more, never less." A weighted silence stretched between us as his eyes held mine, seeming to search for something beyond mere understanding. I nodded slowly. 7 rotations. Understood. Good. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. "Let us continue." The remainder of the tour passed in a blur of information as he detailed the intricate operations of the facility. By the time we returned to the foyer, my mind was saturated with new protocols and unspoken expectations. Dr. Ellis handed me a leather-bound schedule and a set of ornate brass keys. "You begin tomorrow at dawn," he said. "I trust you'll arrive prepared." "Of course," I replied, the keys cold and heavy in my palm. He studied me for a moment longer before nodding once, then turned and disappeared down a dimly lit corridor without another word. I stood alone in the silence, the weight of the keys seeming to grow with each passing moment. As I made my way back to my car, the image of Section 13 lingered in my thoughts, its presence a shadow I couldn't quite shake. The forest seemed to lean closer as I drove away, ancient trees flanking the narrow road like sentinels. I told myself it was just a door, just a new position, but the unease that had taken root refused to be dismissed. The keys remained heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the commitment I had made. My first week at Hollow Pines Sanctuary unfolded with methodical precision. Each day brought a routine that became increasingly familiar, moving between the preservation chamber, the visitation areas, and the climate-controlled storage sections. The pervasive scent of sandalwood and preservation chemicals became less noticeable as the days passed, the soft humming of the building systems a constant companion to my work. Evenings were dedicated to meticulous documentation, preparation of ceremonial spaces, and ensuring every surface gleamed with obsessive attention to detail. The work demanded focus, allowing little opportunity for my mind to wander. I grew accustomed to the peculiar stillness of the building, to the way sound seemed to be absorbed rather than echo. After my initial training period, my schedule shifted to include overnight responsibilities. Dr. Ellis met me at the beginning of my first night shift, handing me the keys with unusual solemnity. "The night transforms this place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The building speaks differently after dark. Attend to your duties and avoid unnecessary exploration." His eyes held mine with unusual intensity. I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was being genuinely cautionary or indulging in melodrama. His expression remained impassive, giving nothing away. "And remember, Section 13?" he added with emphasis. 7 rotations, I responded automatically. "I remember." His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, as though measuring my resolve, before he nodded and walked away, his footsteps fading until silence reclaimed the corridor. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I moved through my tasks with practiced efficiency. The preservation chamber gleamed under the soft lighting by the time I finished, instruments arranged with surgical precision. The administrative work, though tedious, provided a comforting structure to the night. Names and dates in ledgers, a rhythm of documentation that anchored the hours as they passed. It wasn't until the early hours of morning, that hushed time when the night feels most absolute, that I noticed the change. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin with palpable weight. The silence deepened, becoming almost tangible in its intensity. Then I heard it, a gentle, deliberate knocking. Rhythmic and measured, it resonated through the stillness like a heartbeat. I froze, my pen suspended above the ledger I'd been completing. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it, but then it came again, Tap, 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 soft but unmistakable like fingertips against wood. I placed my pen down carefully, the small sound seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. Rising from my desk, I followed the sound, each tap drawing me further into the corridor. The amber wall sconces cast elongated shadows that seemed to sway slightly as I passed, though there was no breeze to move them. The knocking grew more distinct as I approached the storage chambers, not frantic or erratic but measured and purposeful, as though whoever, or whatever, was creating it intended to be heard but not to alarm. I found myself standing before Section 13, the soft amber light reflecting dully off the polished oak. The air here was colder, raising goosebumps on my arms despite my wool sweater. The knocking continued, steady and insistent, seeming to emanate from behind the heavy door. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the lock, the brass keys chiming softly as I removed them from my pocket. 7 rotations, always 7. I turned the key once, the mechanism clicking softly beneath my fingers. The knocking persisted, neither increasing nor decreasing in volume or pace. I turned the key a second time, feeling the tumblers align with mechanical precision. The sound continued unwavering. Finally, I completed the 7th rotation, the lock releasing with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a vacuum of sound that pressed against my ears with almost physical force. I stood motionless, keys clutched in my hand, the sudden absence of sound more unsettling than the knocking had been. The air felt charged as though waiting for something to happen. I slowly backed away from the door, my eyes never leaving its surface. That's when I felt it, a presence. Not a sound or a sight, but a certainty that I was not alone. The hair at the nape of my neck rose, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes following my retreat. Each step back felt like moving through water, my movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. The sensation of being observed followed me all the way back to my desk, where I sank into my chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. I stared at the documentation before me, the neat rows of text blurring as I tried to focus. The knocking was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, settling over me like a shroud. Morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of the staff lounge, casting prismatic patterns across the polished floor. I sat at the small round table, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The events of the night before replayed in my mind. The knocking, the silence, the unsettling feeling of being observed by something I couldn't see. I hadn't slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence again, the weight of attention pressing down on me. The sound of the door opening pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see Dr. Ellis entering the room, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm as he scanned its contents. He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a cup of tea, the porcelain cup clinking softly against the saucer in the quiet room. "Dr. Ellis," I said, my voice more resolute than I felt. He paused, the teapot suspended in midair before he carefully set it down and turned to face me. His expression was neutral, expectant. "Yes, Dr. Mercer?" I rose from my chair, which scraped slightly against the floor, the sound harsh in the otherwise silent room. "I need to know what's in Section 13. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, though his composed expression remained unchanged. He placed his portfolio on the sideboard and folded his hands together in front of him. I trust you followed protocol last night? His voice was calm, measured. I did, I confirmed, maintaining eye contact. 7 rotations exactly as instructed. But there was knocking from inside, and after it stopped, I hesitated, searching for the right words. I felt something watching me. He regarded me silently for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slight exhale, he lifted his tea and took a deliberate sip. It's not what's in the section, he said finally, his voice low and precise, but what the section keeps contained. The words hung in the air between us. I watched him, waiting for elaboration, but his silence stretched, unyielding. What does that mean? I pressed. What is it containing? Why all the mystery? He placed his cup down with deliberate care. You've been provided with all the information necessary to perform your duties effectively, Dr. Mercer. I suggest you focus on that. That's not an answer, I said, frustration edging into my voice. I deserve to know what I'm dealing with. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Curiosity is rarely rewarded in a place like this. I opened my mouth to argue further, but he raised a hand, silencing me. You've performed admirably thus far. Don't allow imagination to compromise your judgment. With that, he collected his portfolio and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly as he disappeared through the doorway. I remained standing, his cryptic words reverberating in my mind. Not what was in the section, but what it kept contained. The phrase cycled through my thoughts like a riddle without solution. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences intensified. Initially, they were subtle, easily dismissed as products of an overactive imagination in an admittedly atmospheric setting. The whispers came first, distant and indistinct, like fragments of conversation carried on a breeze that didn't exist. I told myself it was the sound of the old building settling, the natural creaking of wood and stone in the quiet. But the whispers persisted, growing clearer though never quite intelligible, words almost forming before dissolving back into meaningless sound. Then came the physical disturbances. Ceremonial implements I had carefully arranged would be found scattered when I returned. Doors I had personally secured would swing open, their hinges sighing softly in the still air. Once, I returned to the lounge to find my teacup placed precisely in the center of the table, though I distinctly remembered leaving it by the sink. The air grew increasingly cold no matter how many layers I wore, the chill seeping into my bones like a living thing. And always, there was that sensation, the oppressive weight of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking my every movement throughout the building. Night shifts became increasingly difficult. The silence pressed in with suffocating intensity, broken only by whispers and occasional knocking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took to humming softly as I worked, the sound a small barrier against the encompassing quiet. I considered resignation more than once. The thought of surrendering my keys and walking away from Hollow Pines Sanctuary was tempting in its simplicity. But something always held me back, perhaps pride or stubbornness or a need to understand what was happening. The strange occurrences weren't random. I began to notice patterns emerging from the apparent chaos. The whispers always led toward Section 13. Objects moved as though drawn to it by some invisible force. Even the air itself seemed to change, growing colder and denser the closer I came to that heavy oak door. One night, as I stood in the corridor outside Section 13, the cold air settling around me like a shroud, I made a decision. I wouldn't leave, not yet. Whatever was happening here, whatever the building was trying to communicate, I needed to understand it, even if that meant confronting whatever waited behind that door. Several nights after my unsettling experiences at Section 13, I found myself patrolling the corridors, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the ornate moldings and weathered wood paneling that lined the hallways. I stood outside Section 13, the air unusually still, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the climate control systems. I turned away from the door, determined to focus on completing my assigned tasks. My footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors as I made my way down the corridor, the stillness of the building feeling different tonight, more alert, as though the very walls were conscious of my presence. I was halfway to the preservation chamber when I heard it, a soft sound like footsteps, unhurried and deliberate. I stopped, listening intently. The sound came again, the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking with measured steps. I turned, directing my flashlight beam down the corridor behind me. The hallway stretched empty, the shadows undisturbed. "Hello." My voice sounded thin in the expansive space. No response came, just the distant mechanical sounds of the building and the soft flutter of my pulse in my ears. I took a cautious step forward, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Someone was here, I was certain of it. Rounding the corner, I saw him, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, silhouetted against the soft glow of an emergency exit sign. His posture was eerily still, hands resting at his sides with unnatural calm. As I raised my flashlight, the beam revealed his features, gaunt and pale, with striking amber eyes that seemed to reflect the light with unusual intensity. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I expected. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Then, with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, he took a single step toward me, his movement fluid yet somehow wrong, like a marionette with two loose strings. "My name is Nathaniel," he said, his voice resonant and smooth. "I was the caretaker here, a very long time ago." I studied him carefully. There had been no mention of a Nathaniel in any of the facility records I'd reviewed, no indication that anyone else had access to the building after hours. "You shouldn't be here," I said, maintaining my position. "The sanctuary is closed to visitors." Nathaniel's smile widened slightly. "I'm hardly a visitor," he said. "I'm ensuring that everything remains as it should." "Ensuring what remains as it should?" I repeated, unease growing in the pit of my stomach. He didn't answer immediately, instead taking another step forward, his movements unnervingly smooth. "You've sensed it, haven't you?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the strangeness of our encounter. "The way this place breathes at night. The way it listens." I swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel's gaze seemed to penetrate beyond the surface, seeing something I couldn't. "Those who depart don't always leave," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Some remain caught between realms, and this sanctuary, it calls to them, a beacon in their darkness." A chill ran along my spine, and I took an involuntary step backward. "What do you mean, A beacon? He didn't answer, instead turning his head slightly as though listening to something I couldn't hear. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. "You've experienced it, haven't you?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispers, the cold, the sensation of being observed. I started to respond, but words failed me. He was right. I had felt all of those things night after night, the weight of unseen attention pressing down on me, the whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. "What do you know about Section 13? I asked, my voice hushed. Nathaniel's expression shifted subtly. "Section 13, he repeated as though tasting the words. "That's where the veil is thinnest, where the boundary wavers." "The boundary?" I pressed, taking a cautious step forward. "What boundary? What's in there?" His amber eyes locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. "It's not what's in there," he said, echoing Dr. Ellis's words from weeks before. "It's what it keeps at bay." My stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising slightly. "What is it keeping at bay?" Nathaniel's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. "Curiosity," he said, his tone almost amused, "is a dangerous indulgence in a place like this." I took another step toward him, frustration building. "You're not answering my questions. And you're asking the wrong ones," he replied, his voice calm and infuriatingly enigmatic. "You should be questioning why you remain, why you haven't walked away despite everything you've experienced." I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, he turned away, his movements impossibly fluid. The shadows seemed to embrace him as he retreated, his figure becoming increasingly indistinct with each step. I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but he was gone. The corridor empty save for the dust motes floating in the beam of light. I stood motionless, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The building felt different now, heavier somehow, as though something fundamental had shifted. Only the memory of Nathaniel's amber eyes and cryptic warnings remained, etched into my consciousness like a brand. That same night, the memory of the rhythmic knocking still echoed in my mind as I moved on to my next task. The flashlight seemed to grow heavier in my hand as I made my way down the corridor, the soft hum of the building systems filling the silence. The atmosphere felt more oppressive tonight, as though the very air had thickened, becoming difficult to breathe. I had just finished organizing the preservation chamber when a thunderous crash shattered the stillness. The sound was metallic and final, reverberating through the corridors like a gunshot. I froze, the cloth I'd been using slipping from my fingers and falling to the floor with a soft sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the aftermath of the crash. For a moment I couldn't move. Then the silence rushed back, heavier than before, pressing against my ears with almost physical force. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I switched it on. The beam wavered as I stepped into the corridor, each footstep seeming to echo endlessly. The crash had come from the direction of the storage chambers. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced myself forward, each step measured and deliberate. The door to the main storage chamber loomed ahead, slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible between door and frame. The overhead lights flickered, their soft amber glow unsteady and wavering. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The air here was frigid, biting through my clothing as though I wore nothing at all. I pushed the door open, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the chamber, catching the gleam of polished wood and the dull sheen of brass fixtures. The door to Section 13 stood wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. The lock dangled from the door frame, twisted and broken as though it had been wrenched apart by impossible force. I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the empty interior of the section. The ceremonial vessel that had been stored there was gone, the plinth where it had rested standing bare and accusatory in the beam of light. Cold air poured from the open doorway, wrapping around me like spectral fingers. This wasn't possible. The lock had been secure. I had turned it 7 times exactly as instructed. I had followed every protocol with exacting precision. A soft sound broke through my racing thoughts, a gentle creak that sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the chamber, but there was nothing visible, just the empty room with its polished surfaces and gleaming fixtures. My breathing was shallow and rapid as I forced myself to move, to search the facility. I stepped back into the corridor, my footsteps echoing as I moved toward the preservation chamber. The air grew heavier with each step, the flashlight beam wavering as I reached the door. My hand shook as I pushed it open, the hinges sighing softly. The preservation chamber was dim, the overhead lights casting long shadows across the walls and floor. My gaze was immediately drawn to the central table. The ceremonial vessel was there, placed in the center of the table, its ancient bronze surface gleaming dully in the low light. The lid that had sealed it was now resting beside it, the intricate symbols etched into its surface clearly visible. I couldn't move, my legs frozen in place, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The vessel had been securely locked in Section 13. There was no logical way it could be here now. As I watched, paralyzed, a thin stream of what looked like smoke began to rise from the open vessel, the wispy tendrils curling and twisting in the still air. The smoke moved with purpose, not dispersing as it should but coalescing, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving and reforming. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening, it wasn't possible. A soft sound behind me broke through my paralysis, the whisper of movement, barely audible. I felt the air shift, the unmistakable presence of someone standing close, too close. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. Nathaniel stood there, his tall frame half hidden in shadow, his amber eyes fixed on mine with grim intensity. "You've witnessed it now," he said, his voice low and even. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, the weight of what I was seeing pressing down on me like a physical thing as the cold air swirled around us. The chill air pressed against my skin as Nathaniel's words hung in the silence. The chaos of the past hour still echoed in my mind. The broken lock at Section 13, the vessel's impossible relocation, the smoke that moved with unnatural purpose. Now the preservation chamber was quiet, almost deceptively so. I had barely had a moment to process it all, and yet here I stood in the dim light with Nathaniel, the weight of revelation pressing down on me. My breath came in shallow bursts, my chest tight as I turned my gaze back to the vessel on the table. The smoke had dissipated, but the open vessel's presence felt anything but inert. I shivered, the memory of those forming and dissolving shapes sending a fresh wave of unease through me. Nathaniel stepped closer, his movements deliberate and precise, his figure cutting through the dim light with unnatural clarity. I wanted to speak, to demand explanations, but my throat felt constricted, my voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, his amber eyes fixed on me with unwavering intensity. "This sanctuary," he began, his voice low and measured, "is not what it appears to be. It never has been." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze though my hands trembled at my sides. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel's gaze shifted briefly to the vessel before returning to me. Hollow Pines was constructed on a site where the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, too permeable. The energy here attracts them, those who cannot release their hold on this world. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend. Those who cannot release their hold? The departed, he said simply. Most transition beyond, but others, spirits anchored by regret, by rage, by unfinished matters, they linger, caught between realms. And this place calls to them like a beacon in darkness. The room felt colder now, the chill biting into my skin despite my woolen sweater. I glanced at the vessel again, its open mouth somehow more threatening in its stillness. "And Section 13? I asked, my voice firmer now. "What does it have to do with this?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Section 13 is a threshold, a barrier. It contains the ones who have become too powerful, too corrupted by their extended time in the in-between. It prevents them from crossing over." "Crossing over to where?" I demanded, a new urgency in my voice. "To us," he said softly. "To the living." The words hit me with physical force. I stared at him, searching his face for any indication that this was some elaborate deception, but his expression remained grave, his eyes steady. "Why wasn't I told any of this?" I asked, indignation rising through my fear. "Why did Dr. Ellis keep me in the dark?" "Because he believed you would leave," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "Most would. But you're still here, aren't you?" I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my tongue. He was right. Despite everything, the whispers, the cold, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes, I had remained. Something had kept me here, a curiosity or determination I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained alert. "You're not merely here to tend to earthly remains, Dr. Mercer. You're here to guide the lingering spirits." "Guide them?" I repeated, the concept foreign and unsettling. "I don't understand." He gestured toward the vessel on the table. "That spirit," he said, his voice quieter now, "is trapped. It clings to our realm, bound by whatever pain or regret it couldn't release in life. If we don't help it transition, it will remain here, growing stronger with each passing day, strong enough eventually to breach the barriers that separate our worlds." The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier, colder. I looked at the vessel, trying to reconcile its ordinary appearance with the extraordinary claims Nathaniel was making. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth-wrapped bundle. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a white candle, a small vial of amber liquid, and a piece of polished obsidian worn smooth at the edges. "We perform the rite of transition," he said simply. "It's the only way to guide the spirit to its proper place." I stared at the objects, my mind struggling to adjust to this new reality. "A ritual?" I asked. "What kind of ritual?" "One that has been performed within these walls for centuries," he replied, his tone calm yet resolute. "It isn't complicated, but it requires focus and absolute belief." I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me. I forced my racing thoughts to still. "All right," I said finally, my voice steadier than I had expected. "What do I need to do?" He handed me the obsidian and gestured toward the floor. "We must inscribe the sigils, a circle first, then the binding marks within. I'll guide you." My hands trembled as I knelt on the cold marble floor, the obsidian smooth against my palm. Nathaniel crouched beside me, his movements fluid and precise as he directed me. The circle came first, its edge smooth and unbroken. Then came the sigils, intricate flowing patterns that seemed to shimmer faintly as I completed each one. When the markings were complete, Nathaniel placed the candle at the center of the circle and lit it with a match that seemed to appear from nowhere. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He uncorked the vial of amber liquid and handed it to me. "Anoint the vessel," he instructed. 3 drops at the north, east, south, and west points of its rim. I hesitated, the weight of the task pressing down on me. I tilted the vial, allowing 3 precise drops to fall onto the bronze rim, moving clockwise to each cardinal point. The liquid gleamed in the candlelight, seeming to pulse with a light of its own. Nathaniel began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic. He gestured for me to join him, and I stumbled over the unfamiliar words at first, my voice uncertain. But as the chant continued, something shifted. The air grew charged with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the room. The smoke began to rise from the vessel again, more substantial now, gathering above it in a swirling column that grew brighter with each repetition of the chant. The room warmed, the oppressive chill replaced by a gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from the circle itself. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The smoke dispersed, not dissipating but seeming to dissolve upward, passing through the ceiling as though it were not there. The vessel remained, but it looked different somehow, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from it. Nathaniel extinguished the candle, his movements deliberate and precise. He turned to me, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You did well," he said simply. I didn't respond immediately, my hands still trembling as I set the vial down. The faint residue of the amber liquid lingered on my fingertips, carrying a scent like cedar and rain. The room was peaceful now, calm in a way it hadn't been before. As I rose to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, the full weight of my new understanding settled over me. The danger, the responsibility, the uncertainty, it was all real, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't walk away. Not now. Not ever. Several weeks later, on a quiet night shift, I found myself settling into the strange rhythm of my new reality. Hollow Pines Sanctuary had become more than just a workplace. It was a threshold where the boundaries between worlds thinned and sometimes broke. Nathaniel's visits had grown less frequent, his guidance more pointed when he did appear. He would materialize without warning, his tall frame emerging from shadows where no one should have been able to hide, his amber eyes carrying an intensity that left no room for doubt. Each time he departed, he left me with new knowledge, new rituals, new truths about the spirits that lingered in this place. "You'll recognize when a spirit is restless," he had said during one of his last appearances. "The signs are subtle but unmistakable once you know how to perceive them. Trust your instincts, Dr. Mercer. You possess everything you need." His words stayed with me, a constant presence even when he was absent. I had learned to sense the shifts in the atmosphere, to hear the whispers that rose from silence, to follow the subtle pull that guided me toward spirits in need of transition. The work was exhausting, draining in ways I never could have imagined before coming to Hollow Pines. But it also gave me something I hadn't realized I was searching for: purpose. The whispers began that night as I was organizing ceremonial implements in the preparation room, the rich scent of beeswax and cedar filling the air. Initially they were barely perceptible, just a faint murmur beneath the steady hum of the climate control system. But as I attuned my senses to them, they grew more distinct, more urgent, until they became impossible to ignore. I set down the silver vessel I'd been polishing, its surface reflecting the soft amber light as I straightened. The air seemed to condense around me, the temperature dropping noticeably as though the room itself were exhaling a frozen breath. I knew this sensation now. I had been waiting for it, preparing for it. Stepping out into the corridor, I felt the chill intensify, raising goosebumps along my arms. The whispers surrounded me, coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I returned to my apartment that night, my mind still reeling from the events at the mortuary. Sleep eluded me as I paced my small living room, replaying the ritual in my mind. The sigils, the chanting, the smoke that had passed through solid ceiling, none of it made logical sense, yet I had witnessed it all. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but with it came a strange clarity. I dressed mechanically and returned to the mortuary, drawn back as if by an invisible thread. Nathaniel was waiting, as though he had anticipated my return. "You have questions," he said simply. "Countless," I admitted, following him down the corridor. "How long has this been happening? How many spirits have you guided? And why me? Why bring me into this world?" He paused at the door to a room I hadn't entered before. "The Mercers have been guides for generations," he said, unlocking the heavy oak door. "Your grandmother was one of the most powerful I've ever known." My grandmother? The revelation struck me like a physical blow. She was just a doctor. A surgeon. "She was much more," Nathaniel said, pushing open the door to reveal a small library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines etched with symbols similar to those we had drawn on the floor. "This is your inheritance, Dr. Mercer. Your grandmother left this collection for you." I approached the nearest shelf, my fingers trailing over the ancient bindings. One volume seemed to call to me, its cover a deep blue that reminded me of my grandmother's eyes. I pulled it free, opening it to find her familiar handwriting filling the pages. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew I would come here." "She did," Nathaniel confirmed. "The gift often skips a generation. Your father never showed the sensitivity, but you." He gestured to the book in my hands. You've always felt it, haven't you? The presence of those who have passed. I thought back to the whispers I'd heard in empty rooms, the shadows I'd glimpsed at the edges of my vision, the inexplicable knowledge I sometimes had about patients, knowing when they would recover or when they would not. I had always attributed it to medical intuition, to observation and experience. There are more spirits in need of transition, Nathaniel continued. More vessels waiting. The question is, will you take up your grandmother's mantle? I looked down at the journal in my hands, at the careful diagrams and notations. My grandmother had documented everything, her experiences, her successes, her rare failures. She had prepared this path for me. I will, I said, the words feeling both foreign and utterly right on my tongue. I'll need to learn everything. Teach me. Nathaniel's face relaxed into a genuine smile. We begin tonight, he said. There's a vessel coming in more urgent than most. A child taken before her time. The responsibility settled on my shoulders, heavy yet somehow fitting. I'll be ready, I promised. That night, as we prepared the mortuary for the arrival of the child's vessel, I felt my grandmother's presence beside me, guiding my hands as I traced the sigils. The ritual was both the same and different. The circle, the candle, the amber liquid, but the chants were unique to the spirit we sought to guide. When it was done, when the smoke had risen and passed through the ceiling, I felt a peace I had never known. I understood now what my grandmother had discovered years ago, that death was not an ending but a transition, and that some souls needed help to complete their journey. In the months that followed, I divided my time between the hospital and the mortuary, between treating the living and guiding the dead. My colleagues noticed the change in me, a new confidence, a deeper compassion, but none could have guessed its source. At night, I studied my grandmother's journals, learning the history of the Mercers and the ancient art we practiced. I discovered that our family had been guides for centuries, working alongside the Nathaniels, for there had been many, each training their successor just as mine was training me. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I would feel my grandmother's presence, not trapped or lingering, but visiting briefly from wherever her spirit had traveled. She would never need a guide to show her the way. She had always known her path. As for me, I had found mine at last. In the hospital corridors where I saved lives, and in the secret chambers of the mortuary where I saved souls, I had discovered my true purpose, bridging the gap between worlds, escorting lost spirits home. The vessel on the table before me now belongs to an old woman who died alone. As I prepare the ritual circle, I whisper a promise to her, wherever she is lingering. I will guide you home. And I know with absolute certainty that I will.